in 1619 and 1620, being that in 1619 Africans came over by via the Portuguese, okay, which were then made into indentured servants and or slaves because of the tobacco growth and the hardships that of getting that. And then, of course, in 1620, the arrival of females, more than just the two that arrived in 1608. Something else very important happens in 1619, okay, and that is what we're going to be talking about today. The first government, okay, is established in Jamestown, not the first government in the world, but the first government in Jamestown in the New World was created in 1619. And you have to, it makes sense, okay, because the Africans were coming, the slaves were coming, there were a lot of people coming from England, and now there are families being made, the women are there. There needs to be some type of people who were in charge. Now, of course, who was in charge from 1607 to 1619 was the King of England. So you'd have to think about this. Up until this time, if there was a problem in Jamestown, in the New World, they would actually have to send word back to the king, 2-3 months on the boat. It would then be returned back 2 or 3 more months, and they would get word from the king. So obviously the Virginians, okay, said to themselves, well, this is not going to work for us. So they came up with a new system, and what they called this was the General Assembly, okay. The assembly included 2 citizens, okay, representatives, and those 2 citizens, okay, from each of the parts of Virginia were called burgesses, okay. So it's Burgesses. It's basically like making the I'm trying to make the parallel here of our Congress. There's the Senate is where everybody goes, but each senator who's in the Senate is representing a state, okay, and there are 2 from each state. Well, it's kind of the same idea from the General Assembly, and this is what 300 years before, is that they broke up Virginia into different parts depending on where people moved to, and then there would be representatives, 2 representatives from each part called burgesses, just like senators, and they would come along with the governor's council. That's the person who's in charge and the people that are with them, and the governor, okay. They met as one huge body. You can see right here. Oops. Okay, right there you can see that they first elected the legislative body, okay, English American giving settlers the opportunity to control their own government, okay. So it was the first time that they were able to start to control their own government. However, they did not have complete control, okay. Basically, the whole Virginia Assembly was the governor, the person in charge. Now, guess who appointed the governor? The king. Okay, so the person in charge is still the king. However, then the governor has council members. So the person who's in charge via the king picks people to say, okay, I want you to help me out. In addition to that, there was 2 elected representatives. And that was the first time that there were representatives actually being in this area of making decisions. Usually it would be just one person making a decision. It would have been the governor. And the governor would have said, this is what we do because I speak for the King of England. It was very similar to what we read in Blood on the River, where one person was in charge. So this was a big thing, okay? But what you need to know is that still, if you think about it, the king is still in charge because he is the person who is making the governor, okay? So let's watch a quick video on this so you can make a visual representation connection.
The evolution of representative government in the United States began with the first meeting of the General Assembly at Jamestown in 1619. Shareholder discontent with martial law in the Virginia colony prompted the creation in 1618 of new documents collectively called the Great Charter. These directives led to the establishment of the first legislative assembly in the New World and detailed how the Jamestown colony was to be governed. 20 representatives, called burgesses, from 10 plantations and settlements, met with the governor and his council on July 30th, 1619, in the church at Jamestown. In that 6-day meeting, the Assembly passed legislation concerning Indian relations and the personal affairs of the colonists, and approved the colony's first tax assessment. This initial meeting of the General Assembly helped shape democracy and representative government in our nation today.
So it definitely helped because everybody had a voice through the representatives. Okay. Before this, again, like I said, only one person was in charge. Now, of course, there are some rules to these two representatives. First, you needed to be white. Number two, you needed to be male. Okay, so you had to be white, you had to be male. Number three, you had to own land, and you had to be above 17. Okay, so there were a lot of rules to actually be one of those elected representatives in the General Assembly. Okay, so if you can think about it in terms of, I don't know, I guess like a pyramid, back to here, okay, is that let's see if I can write on here, yeah, okay, the person who's in charge, the top, okay, maybe like we could even say the president, okay, I'm doing it with my mouse, so it's not very good. I'm going to use my actual mouse, okay, this is the governor. Okay, and the governor, who's in charge of everybody, okay, he's elected by the king. So the king still has a lot of influence, okay? And then below the governor, okay, the governor is basically choosing people, probably people likes his friends or whatever, to be his counsel to help him, okay? So this is not really new. Where it actually becomes really important in our own governmental system today is that below that they were choosing 2 representatives from each part of Virginia. Okay, so that's a big deal, okay, because they're actually getting the word from the people that are living in Virginia. Up until this point, it was you either did what this person said or you went to the gallows. Now they're actually trying to get people and their opinion. Now, of course, these representatives, they have to be, like I said, okay, adult white male above 17. They had to own land, aka be rich in many cases. And whatever these representatives and this whole General Assembly made as a decision, it would then have to, they'd have to follow. It was the rule. So you can imagine that this person's rich, these people are rich, these people are rich. So obviously they're going to make a lot of rules that are going to help the rich. Also, it's important to know that ultimately the king has the last say still, okay, because he's the person that's making the governor in charge. But something happens, okay, in 1640, so about 20 years later, okay. So here, actually, this is a better one than even what I just did, okay. The governor is in charge, okay. Okay, this was the first governor, but that's not important, okay. He was imported by the Virginia Company, so it was over in England. Then he chose some friends, basically, powerful white men, okay, to help him. There were 6 in total. And then, okay, they broke up Virginia into 11 settlements, okay. You can see here there were 2 for each of those 11, so it'd be 22 in total. It'd be above 17, you had to be male, you had to own land, you also had to be white, okay. And they were chosen for freer adult men, okay, who could vote. Women couldn't do it either. Okay, so that goes back to what I was about to say, which is what happens in 1640, okay, is the Burgesses, okay, the people who were from the New World, okay, remember this governor was appointed by England, and his council was also appointed by England because, the governor is the person who does that, okay, they broke apart, separated, okay, which is kind of, so if you really want to think about it, you can think on this side is England, right, because again, the king is still in charge of these 2 people, and then they separate from one another because at first they were all together, and the Burgesses are now alone in a separate building, okay, which already starts to create tension because You know, the governor might say, I'm getting the rules from the King of England. He's saying that we need to do this. And the Virginians, okay, the Burgesses, the people who are the representatives, are saying, no, I don't want to follow the rules of England in many cases. The reason this even happens in 1640, okay, is because in England, you don't need to know this, but it's an interesting fact, there was a civil war, okay, and the King of England, okay, was basically too preoccupied with not dying, not losing his whole country in the civil war in England. Because that was happening, they weren't getting word from the King of England. The King of England was not talking to the governor, was not giving them orders. So the people in Virginia basically said, you know what? I'm going to ignore these guys and we're going to just run it ourselves. The problem happens, okay, is that in the late 1640s, the Civil War ends in England and they've won. Okay, the King of England wins. Now he has more time and he looks into the new colony and says, okay, guys, I'm back. I'm taking control. And these people are saying, no way. Okay, we have been able to govern ourselves. We've been doing it fine for a long time now. We don't need you. We don't need these people telling us what to do. You don't even live over here. And this actually is the beginning of the tension that occurs between England and Virginia, and eventually, almost 100 years later, we have the Revolutionary War. Okay, interesting enough, the House of Burgesses is still here today. Okay, it's still called that. Okay, we have there's two parts still even. Okay, we have the Senate of Virginia. Okay, still called the General Assembly. It's really interesting. And then we have the House of Delegates. They're called delegates now instead of Burgesses, but this was back then called the House of Burgesses, the Senate of Virginia. Okay, and the General Assembly is one of three branches or sections of government today. Okay, there's the General Assembly, okay, which is the original Burgesses. There's the governor and his council, which now are the executive branch, and then there's the Virginia courts. This is something we'll talk about later. Okay, because when people were breaking laws and whatnot during this time, these two were making the decisions, okay, which was the legislative branch and the executive branch, or the governor and his council and the General Assembly. But then eventually they needed a little bit more, so they get to that as well. So now you can think of that this, back then it was the governor and his council, that kind of started to separate away. General Assembly were all the Burgesses, okay. So this is just review, okay, nothing here that we need to really go over. What I'd like you to do now is there are two flip books that I'm going to have you make. One is green, and it's looking at just the General Assembly of 1619, and then one is comparing the General Assembly or Virginia Assembly of 1619 to 1940. I have two examples up on the front of the room. I also have pictures there on Blackboard on how to make it. You'll notice that the compare and contrast of early government I've glued onto a purple paper because I don't have a notebook to glue it in. You can just glue that in on your notebook, okay, and use your notebook paper as where you're going to be putting the orange things, but you can put it on a colored paper as well and then glue that in your notebooks if you'd like. You'll notice, I mean, it will make more sense when you actually look at it, okay? And then tomorrow we're going to learn about and how Jamestown starts to really grow, okay, and eventually, slavery comes like we talked about before, but Virginians, the people in Virginia, start to spread away from just Jamestown as more and more people come, and funny enough, they move the capital away from Jamestown and they move it somewhere else, but it's not Richmond, okay, that will be tomorrow.